The cold morning covered the deserted streets when a woman pushed open the police station door. She held a 3-year-old boy by the hand, his head down and his steps slow. He hadn't spoken since a mysterious episode in their backyard. Upon entering, she saw the station's German shepherd and approached it in silence. She knelt down and whispered something that nobody heard. The dog perked up its ears and pulled hard on its leash, dragging the officer outside. The woman followed him, looking at her grandson without understanding. At the corner, the animal stopped abruptly, staring intently at a narrow street. But what happens next? No one will ever know. Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss a single one. Thank you for joining us. Now, we return to our story. The gavel struck the polished wood of Judge Harrison's bench with a sharp crack that echoed through the modest courtroom of Millbrook County. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden pews where townspeople had gathered for what everyone expected to be a routine civil hearing. Margaret Sullivan sat in the second row, her weathered hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to ignore the way her heart hammered against her ribs. She had been dreading this day for months, ever since Richard Blackwood had filed his lawsuit, claiming she had damaged his property during the community garden project. The whole thing was ridiculous, of course. Everyone in Millbrook knew that Richard was just trying to get back at her for opposing his plans to build a shopping center where the old Miller farm stood. But Richard had money, influence, and a way of making people believe whatever version of the truth served him best. Judge Harrison cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to hear the case of Blackwood versus Sullivan regarding property damage claims stemming from the Millbrook Community Garden Initiative. His voice carried the authority of 30 years on the bench, though Margaret could detect a hint of weariness in his tone. He had presided over enough petty disputes in this small Ohio town to recognize when personal vendettas masqueraded as legitimate legal grievances. Margaret's attorney, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who had recently moved to Millbrook from Cincinnati, shuffled through her papers with practiced efficiency. Across the aisle, Richard's legal team occupied nearly half the plaintiff's table, their expensive suits and briefcases a stark contrast to the humble surroundings. Richard himself sat with his characteristic confident smile, the same expression he wore when addressing the town council or schmoozing at the country club. The bailiff, Deputy Frank Morrison, stood near the side entrance with his usual stoic expression. Frank had grown up in Millbrook, graduated high school with Margaret's son, and knew every family story that had ever circulated through the town's coffee shops and barber shops. He respected Margaret for her volunteer work at the food bank and her efforts to beautify the downtown area, but today he was just doing his job. Mr. Thompson, you may present your opening statement, Judge Harrison announced, nodding toward Richard's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man from Columbus who looked like he charged more per hour than most Millbrook residents made in a week. Thompson rose smoothly, his movements calculated for maximum effect. Your Honor, this case is quite straightforward. The defendant, Ms. Sullivan, acting without proper authorization or permits, organized an excavation project that resulted in significant damage to my client's adjacent property line. We have documented evidence of soil erosion, damaged fencing, and contaminated runoff that has affected the value and usability of Mr. Blackwood's land. Margaret felt her jaw clench. The community garden had been approved by the city council after months of planning and public input. They had been meticulous about staying within the designated boundaries, and any minor soil displacement had been immediately addressed. But she knew that facts mattered less than presentation in situations like this, and Richard's team had clearly invested considerable effort in crafting their narrative. As Thompson continued his polished delivery, painting Margaret as a reckless, Activist who put her environmental agenda ahead of property rights, the side door of the courtroom creaked open. At first, nobody paid much attention. People often slipped in and out of public hearings, and Judge Harrison was known for running an informal courtroom that welcomed community participation. But instead of a late-arriving spectator, something entirely unexpected appeared in the doorway. A German shepherd, its coat gleaming black and tan in the morning light, stepped deliberately into the courtroom. The dog moved with purpose, its intelligent brown eyes scanning the room as if searching for something specific. What made the scene truly extraordinary was the crumpled piece of paper clenched gently but firmly in its jaws. The rhythmic clicking of the dog's nails against the hardwood floor gradually drew attention away from Thompson's speech. Conversations among the spectators died to whispers, then to complete silence. Even Thompson paused mid-sentence, his polished presentation faltering as he turned to see what had captured his audience. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and leaned forward, his expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity. In 40 years of legal practice, he'd seen plenty of unusual courtroom moments, but nothing quite like this. The German shepherd walked with unwavering determination toward the front of the courtroom, seeming to navigate the space as if it belonged there. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She recognized the dog immediately. Max had been her constant companion for 7 years, ever since she had adopted him from the county shelter. He was intelligent, loyal, and had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong. But his appearance here at this moment, carrying what appeared to be a document, filled her with a mixture of pride and terror. Max approached the witness stand with the same deliberate pace he used when following a scent trail during their weekend hikes in the state forest. He positioned himself directly in front of the wooden barrier and sat with perfect posture, his tail straight and his eyes fixed on Judge Harrison. The paper in his mouth appeared weathered and yellowed, as if it had been hidden away for years. Richard Blackwood's confident smile faltered for the first time that morning. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering urgently, but his eyes never left the dog. Margaret could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to calculate how this unexpected development might affect his carefully orchestrated case. "Well," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying a note of bemused interest, "this is certainly a first for my courtroom. Bailiff Morrison, would you please secure whatever document that animal is carrying? We should examine it before proceeding." Frank Morrison approached Max cautiously. He had dealt with enough police dogs during his years in law enforcement to respect the training and intelligence of working animals. Max released the paper without resistance, his tail wagging slightly as if proud of completing an important task. Frank handed the crumpled document to Judge Harrison, who spread it carefully on his bench. The courtroom remained in absolute silence. As the judge examined the paper, his eyebrows rising slightly as he read. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up at the assembled crowd. "This appears to be a handwritten note," he announced, dated approximately 5 years ago and signed by someone whose name I will not read aloud until we can verify its authenticity. However, the contents suggest information relevant to property disputes in this area during that time period. Margaret's hands began to tremble. 5 years ago was when the Miller family had first approached the town about selling their farm. It was also when Richard had begun his aggressive campaign to acquire as much surrounding land as possible for his development projects. If Max had somehow preserved a document from that time, it could contain information that Richard had worked very hard to keep buried. The prosecution table erupted in hushed but intense conversation. Thompson requested an immediate recess to examine the document and challenge its admissibility. Sarah Chen countered that any evidence brought forward should be thoroughly investigated before being dismissed. The spectators in the gallery buzzed with excitement, sensing that their quiet Tuesday morning had suddenly become the most interesting legal proceeding Millbrook had seen in years. Judge Harrison called for order with a firm bang of his gavel. Given the unusual circumstances, I am calling a 2-hour recess to allow both parties to examine this document and determine its relevance to the current case. We will reconvene at 2 p.m. to address any motions regarding its admissibility. As the courtroom began to empty, Margaret remained in her seat, watching as Max trotted over to her with obvious satisfaction. She scratched behind his ears, wondering what other secrets might be hidden in places only he could find, and whether she was prepared for the truth to finally come to light after all these years of careful silence. The afternoon session brought a noticeably different energy to the Millbrook County Courthouse. Word of the morning's unusual events had spread through town with the speed that only small communities could achieve. The gallery, which had been half empty that morning, was now packed with curious residents who had abandoned their lunch plans to witness what many were already calling the most bizarre legal proceeding in county history. Margaret returned to her seat with Max, walking calmly beside her. She had spent the recess at the small park across from the courthouse, trying to process what had just happened while fielding concerned calls from friends and family members who had heard various versions of the story. Her sister Linda had driven over from the next county, convinced that Margaret was having some kind of breakdown that involved training her dog to disrupt legal proceedings. "I still don't understand how Max got that paper," Linda whispered as they settled into their seats. "And why would he bring it to the courthouse of all places?" Margaret shook her head, genuinely puzzled. Max had displayed remarkable intelligence throughout their years together, but this behavior was unprecedented. The dog had spent the recess period calm and alert, showing no signs of stress despite the unusual circumstances. If anything, he seemed proud of himself, as if he had accomplished something important. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom promptly at 2 p.m., his expression more serious than it had been that morning. The document examination had clearly revealed something significant, though he maintained his professional composure as he called the session to order. "After careful review during our recess," he began, "both legal teams have agreed that the document brought forward this morning is authentic and dates to approximately 5 years ago. While its origin remains a mystery, the content is relevant enough to this case that we will proceed with full investigation." Thompson stood immediately, his earlier confidence replaced by barely controlled agitation. "Your Honor, while we do not dispute the document's age, we must question the circumstances of its appearance. The defense has had ample time to prepare. This case, and the sudden emergence of evidence under such dramatic circumstances, suggests orchestrated manipulation of these proceedings." Sarah Chen rose to respond, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Your Honor, my client was as surprised by this development as everyone else in this courtroom. She had no knowledge of this document's existence, nor any ability to direct its discovery. I would also like to note that the opposing counsel's immediate assumption of manipulation suggests they may have reason to fear what this evidence reveals." The paper in question lay on Judge Harrison's bench, its contents now photocopied and distributed to both legal teams. Margaret had been allowed to read it during the recess, and the words had hit her like a physical blow. The handwritten note was signed by Robert Miller, the farmer whose land had become the center of so much controversy. In it, he detailed a conversation with Richard Blackwood that painted a very different picture of the land acquisition negotiations than what had been publicly presented. According to Miller's note, Richard had approached him with threats disguised as friendly advice. The farmer wrote about pressure tactics, veiled references to tax assessments that could be adjusted if Miller didn't cooperate, and promises that accidents happen to people who stand in the way of progress. Most damaging of all was Miller's claim that Richard had admitted to falsifying environmental reports to make the farmland appear unsuitable for agricultural use, thereby driving down its value. The implications were staggering. If Miller's account was accurate, Richard's entire development strategy was built on coercion and fraud. The community garden project had been established on a small portion of the Miller property specifically because environmental testing had shown it to be perfectly healthy soil, contradicting the reports Richard had used to justify his lowball purchase offers. As the afternoon wore on, Judge Harrison announced that he was calling for additional witnesses to be brought forward. Given the serious allegations contained in this document, I'm extending this hearing to allow for a thorough investigation of these claims. I am also ordering both parties to submit any additional documentation related to land acquisitions and environmental assessments conducted in this area over the past 6 years. Richard's face had grown increasingly pale throughout the proceedings. He huddled frequently with his legal team, their conversations becoming more animated as the afternoon progressed. Margaret noticed that several of his usual supporters in the community had quietly slipped out of the courtroom, their loyalty apparently not strong enough to weather potential scandal. The most unexpected development came when Frank Morrison approached the bench with news that another witness had come forward. Tom Mitchell, a veteran journalist who had covered local government for the Millbrook Gazette for over 20 years, requested permission to address the court. "Your Honor," Tom said as he took the witness stand, "I've been following local land development issues for my newspaper, and I believe I have information relevant to these proceedings. I've also been curious about something I observed this morning that might explain how that document came to light." Tom's testimony revealed that he had been investigating irregularities in property assessments and environmental reports for months. His research had uncovered a pattern of discrepancies that suggested systematic manipulation of land values in specific areas of the county. More intriguingly, he had discovered that several missing documents had been reported stolen from various offices over the past few years, though no formal investigations had been conducted. "As for this morning's events," Tom continued, "I've been researching the history of working dogs in our area. It turns out that the German Shepherd who delivered that document has some unusual training in his background. According to county records, Max was originally trained as a search and rescue dog before being retired to civilian life. His previous handler specialized in document recovery operations." The revelation sent ripples of excitement through the courtroom. Margaret stared at Max, who sat beside her chair with his characteristic alert expression. She had adopted him from the county shelter without knowing his full history, attracted by his gentle temperament and obvious intelligence. The shelter had mentioned that he was a retired working dog, but she had assumed that meant basic obedience, training. Judge Harrison leaned forward with interest. "Mr. Mitchell, are you suggesting that this animal was specifically trained to locate documents?" "That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Your Honor. Search and rescue dogs are often trained to find specific items by scent, including paper documents. If someone had handled that note extensively, the dog could have detected and followed that scent trail to wherever it was hidden." The implications of Tom's testimony were immediately clear to everyone in the courtroom. If Max had been trained to find documents, and if he had somehow picked up a scent trail leading to Robert Miller's hidden note, it meant there might be other documents still waiting to be discovered. Richard Blackwood finally spoke for the first time that day, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Your Honor, this is becoming absurd. We're supposed to believe that a dog just happened to find a 5-year-old document at exactly the right moment to disrupt these proceedings? This is clearly a setup designed to distract from the real issues of this case. But his objection lacked the authority it might have carried that morning. The evidence was mounting that Richard's entire position was built on deception, and his attempts to discredit the proceedings only served to make him appear more desperate. Judge Harrison called for another recess, this time to consider the broader implications of what they had learned. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret found herself surrounded by neighbors and friends, offering support and expressing amazement at the day's developments. "I never would have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself," said Eleanor Patterson, who ran the local diner and had known Margaret for 15 years. Max bringing that paper right into court like he knew exactly what he was doing. Margaret scratched Max's head, still trying to process everything she had learned. Her dog, her faithful companion, had apparently been keeping secrets as carefully as she had. The question now was what other truths were waiting to be uncovered, and whether she was prepared for the consequences of revelations that could shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about her community. The following morning brought unexpected visitors to Margaret's modest two-story house on Maple Street. She was having her usual coffee on the front porch when Sarah Chen's compact sedan pulled into the driveway, followed by a county sheriff's vehicle that made Margaret's heart skip a beat. Max, who'd been dozing in the morning sunshine, immediately stood at attention, his ears pricked forward with interest. Sheriff Patricia Reeves emerged from the patrol car with the measured movements of someone who had spent 20 years dealing with the complexities of small-town law enforcement. She was a fair woman who had earned respect through consistency and integrity, qualities that had served her well in a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Morning, Margaret," Sheriff Reeves said, tipping her hat with a slight smile. "I hope you don't mind the early visit, but we have some developments in yesterday's courtroom situation that require immediate attention." Sarah Chen joined them on the porch, her briefcase and tablet indicating that this was more than a social call. "Margaret, we need to discuss some things that came to light after yesterday's hearing. It seems that Tom Mitchell's investigation uncovered more than just environmental report discrepancies." They settled into the porch chairs while Max positioned himself strategically between Margaret and the visitors, his protective instincts clearly engaged despite the friendly tone of the conversation. Margaret poured coffee for everyone, trying to mask her nervousness with the familiar ritual of hospitality. "Tom's been busy overnight," Sheriff Reeves began, pulling out a small notebook. After yesterday's revelation about Max's training, he decided to dig deeper into the history of missing documents around the county. Turns out there's been a pattern of important papers disappearing from various offices over the past few years, always related to land deals or environmental assessments. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. More importantly, Tom discovered that someone reported a break-in at Robert Miller's house about 6 months after he wrote that note. Nothing valuable was taken, but Miller told the responding officer that some papers from his desk were missing. Margaret felt a chill despite the warm morning air. "Are you saying someone deliberately stole Miller's documents?" That's exactly what we're saying," Sheriff Reeves confirmed. "And based on what Miller told the officer at the time, whoever took those papers knew exactly what they were looking for. They left jewelry, electronics, and cash untouched, but ransacked his home office thoroughly. The implications were staggering. If someone had systematically stolen documents to cover up illegal activities, it suggested a level of planning and desperation that went far beyond simple business disputes." Margaret thought about all the times over the past few years when community members had complained about losing important papers or having their offices mysteriously searched. "There's something else," Sarah said, opening her tablet to display a series of photographs. Tom managed to locate 3 other people who claimed to have written similar notes about their interactions with Richard Blackwood. All of them report that their documents went missing under suspicious circumstances. The photos showed handwritten pages that bore striking similarities to Miller's note. Each one detailed conversations with Richard that involved pressure tactics, veiled threats, and promises of consequences for those who didn't cooperate with his land acquisition plans. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply disturbing. Martha Henderson wrote about Richard suggesting that her late husband's military pension benefits might be reviewed if she didn't sell her property, Sarah continued, scrolling through the images. James Wright documented threats about sudden tax audits and building code violations, and Carol Stevens recorded a conversation where Richard implied that her son's job at the county office might be at risk if she continued opposing his development projects. Margaret absorbed this information with growing horror. These were her friends and neighbors, people she had known for years who had never spoken about being threatened or coerced. The realization that such activities had been happening in secret throughout their close-knit community felt like a betrayal of everything she thought she knew about Millbrook. Max suddenly stood and walked to the edge of the porch, his nose working the air with intense concentration. He moved with the same purposeful energy he had displayed in the courtroom, and Margaret recognized the signs of his search behavior from their hiking trips when he would track interesting scents through the forest. "He's doing it again," she said quietly, watching as Max descended the porch steps and began following some invisible trail across her front yard. "Yesterday in court, and now this. It's like he knows something we don't." Sheriff Reeves and Sarah exchanged glances. "Margaret," the sheriff said carefully, "we need to ask you something important. Have you noticed Max displaying this kind of behavior before? Searching for specific things or bringing you objects you didn't ask him to find?" Margaret thought back over their years together, remembering dozens of small incidents that had seemed like random dog behavior at the time. Max frequently brought her things during their walks: sticks, interesting rocks, and occasionally pieces of paper that she had assumed were just litter. A few times, he had insisted on digging in specific spots in her garden, usually unearthing old containers or buried objects that previous homeowners had left behind. "Now that you mention it," she said slowly, "there have been quite a few times when Max seemed to be looking for something specific. I just thought he was being a typical dog, investigating smells and bringing me random things." "Those random things?" Sarah asked. "Do you still have any of them?" Margaret nodded, feeling foolish for not making the connection earlier. "I keep a box in the garage of interesting things Max finds during our walks. I thought maybe someday I'd use them for art projects or something. Most of it is probably junk, but there are a few papers and small objects." Within minutes, the 3 women were standing in Margaret's garage, examining a cardboard box filled with Max's discoveries from the past 7 years. Most of the contents were indeed random objects: smooth stones, pieces of old pottery, and weathered pieces of wood. But scattered among these treasures were several folded papers, their edges yellowed with age and their surfaces marked by soil and moisture. Sarah carefully extracted the papers using latex gloves she produced from her briefcase. As she unfolded each document, it became clear that Max's collection was far from random. The papers included property surveys, environmental test results, and what appeared to be carbon copies of official county documents, all related to land transactions in the Millbrook area. "This is incredible," Sheriff Reeves said, photographing each document with her phone. "These are county records that were reported missing years ago. We assumed they had been misfiled or accidentally destroyed, but Max has been collecting them systematically." One document in particular caught Sarah's attention. It was a carbon copy of an environmental assessment report dated 4 years earlier, but the conclusions were completely different from the version that had been submitted to the County Planning Commission. The original report showed healthy soil conditions and minimal environmental concerns, while the submitted version had claimed significant contamination issues that would make development inadvisable. This proves Tom's theory about falsified environmental reports, Sarah said, her voice tight with excitement. Someone was systematically replacing genuine assessments with fake ones to manipulate property values and development approvals. Margaret felt dizzy as the full scope of the deception became clear. For years, Richard had been operating a sophisticated scheme to control land development in their area through document theft, falsification, and intimidation. The community garden controversy that had brought them to court was just the tip of an iceberg that threatened to sink everything she thought she knew about her hometown. Max returned to the garage carrying another folded paper in his mouth, his tail wagging with obvious pride. This time, however, the document was cleaner and more recent, as if it had been hidden in a place protected from the elements. As Sarah carefully unfolded this newest discovery, her expression changed from curiosity to shock. The paper contained a detailed accounting of Richard's activities, written in a careful hand and signed by someone whose name made all 3 women gasp in recognition. "This changes everything," Sheriff Reeves said quietly, studying the document. "If this is authentic, we're not just dealing with civil property disputes anymore. This is evidence of systematic fraud, intimidation, and corruption that goes straight to the heart of county government." Margaret looked at Max, who sat beside her with his characteristic alert expression, as if he understood the magnitude of what he had accomplished. Her loyal companion had been quietly gathering evidence for years, following scent trails and instincts that had led him to preserve the truth that others had tried so desperately to bury. The emergency session called by Judge Harrison that afternoon drew the largest crowd the Millbrook County Courthouse had ever seen. News of the morning's discoveries had spread through every coffee shop, barbershop, and grocery store checkout line in town. People who hadn't attended a government meeting in years suddenly found themselves invested in the outcome of what had started as a simple property dispute. Margaret arrived with Max at her side, both of them now the center of unprecedented attention. Local news crews from 3 neighboring counties had set up cameras outside the courthouse, and reporters were interviewing anyone willing to share their thoughts on the unfolding scandal. Margaret declined all requests for interviews, but she couldn't escape the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations that followed her wherever she went. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. Richard Blackwood sat with his expanded legal team, which now included 2 additional attorneys who had driven down from Cleveland overnight. His earlier confidence had been replaced by the grim determination of someone fighting for his reputation and freedom. Judge Harrison entered with Sheriff Reeves and 2 state investigators who had been called in to handle the expanding scope of the case. The presence of state authorities sent a clear message that this was no longer a local civil matter, but a potential criminal investigation with far-reaching implications. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of the extraordinary circumstances. "What began yesterday as a civil hearing has evolved into something much more serious. I have suspended the original proceedings pending a full investigation by state authorities into allegations of fraud, document tampering, and intimidation." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of excitement and concern. Margaret noticed several familiar faces in the crowd, people she had known for years who now looked at her with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. her quiet life as a community volunteer had suddenly thrust her into the center of the biggest scandal in Millbrook's history. Detective Amanda Rodriguez, one of the state investigators, took the stand to address the court. She was a seasoned professional with 15 years of experience in white-collar crime investigation, and her presence lent credibility to the serious nature of the allegations. Based on evidence recovered this morning, Detective Rodriguez announced, "We have identified a pattern of systematic document theft and falsification spanning at least 5 years. The scope of these activities suggests coordination between multiple parties and access to confidential government records." She presented a timeline of events that painted a disturbing picture of organized deception. Beginning 5 years earlier, important documents had begun disappearing from various county offices, always during periods when Richard Blackwood was pursuing land acquisition deals. Environmental reports, property assessments, and historical surveys had been systematically replaced with falsified versions that supported his development goals. Most significantly, Detective Rodriguez continued, "We have recovered evidence suggesting that this operation involved individuals within county government who provided access to secure filing systems and advance knowledge of when specific documents would be needed." The implications sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Corruption within local government was a betrayal that struck at the heart of community trust. Margaret felt sick thinking about how many decisions affecting their town had been influenced by this deception. Tom Mitchell was called to present his investigative findings, which had expanded significantly since his initial testimony. Working through the night with assistance from state investigators, he had uncovered financial connections between Richard and several county employees who had experienced sudden improvements in their economic circumstances over the past few years. County Planning Director Steve Morrison purchased a new boat and renovated his kitchen within 6 months of Richard's largest land acquisition deal, Tom reported, consulting his meticulously organized notes. Environmental Inspector Linda Walsh paid off her student loans and bought a new car immediately after filing reports that supported Richard's development proposals. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. When combined with the recovered documents showing patterns of falsification, it painted a picture of systematic bribery and corruption that had influenced numerous land deals throughout the county. Richard's lead attorney, Thompson, stood to address the court with visible frustration. "Your Honor, my client categorically denies all these allegations. The timing of these so-called discoveries is highly suspicious, and we maintain that this entire situation has been orchestrated to damage Mr. Blackwood's reputation and business interests." But Thompson's objections carried less weight now that state investigators were involved. Detective Rodriguez had already obtained warrants to search Richard's business offices and had begun interviewing county employees who might have been involved in the alleged conspiracy. The most dramatic moment of the session came when Judge Harrison announced that another witness had come forward with information relevant to the investigation. To everyone's surprise, the witness was Janet Morrison, the wife of Deputy Frank Morrison and sister-in-law to the allegedly corrupt planning director. Janet took the witness stand with obvious nervousness, her hands shaking as she swore to tell the truth. She was a quiet woman who worked part-time at the county library and was known for her involvement in church activities and charitable organizations. "I've been struggling with this information for months," Janet began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My brother-in-law Steve has been acting strangely for the past few years, spending money he shouldn't have and making trips to meet with people he wouldn't talk about." She described overhearing phone conversations where Steve discussed taking care of problematic documents and making sure the right reports got filed. Most damaging was her account of seeing Steve destroy papers in his backyard fire pit, including what appeared to be official county documents with distinctive letterheads. "I found some papers he missed," Janet continued, producing a manila envelope from her purse. "They were in his trash, and I kept them because something felt wrong about everything that was happening." The papers Janet had preserved included handwritten notes in Steve Morrison's writing that detailed which documents to remove from county files and when to replace them with altered versions. The notes included specific dates, file numbers, and instructions that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of county record-keeping systems. Detective Rodriguez examined the papers with obvious interest. "Mrs. Morrison, why did you decide to come forward now?" Janet looked directly at Margaret, her eyes filling with tears. "Because Margaret Sullivan is one of the most honest people I know. She's helped my family through difficult times, and she's dedicated her life to making our community better. Watching her go through this legal nightmare because of my brother-in-law's actions became more than I could bear." The emotional weight of Janet's testimony affected everyone in the courtroom. Here was a woman who had chosen to expose her own family member rather than allow an innocent person to suffer for crimes she had witnessed firsthand. Richard's reaction to Janet's testimony was immediate and telling. He turned pale and began whispering urgently to his attorneys, his earlier composure completely shattered. The careful facade he had maintained throughout the proceedings crumbled as the evidence against him became overwhelming. Judge Harrison called for a recess to allow the attorneys and investigators to process this new information. As the courtroom began to empty, Margaret found herself surrounded by community members, offering support and expressing amazement at how the truth was finally emerging. Max remained calm throughout the proceedings, as if he understood that his work of preserving evidence had served its purpose. Margaret scratched behind his ears, marveling at how her loyal companion had somehow known to collect and preserve the very documents that would expose years of deception and corruption. The recess would give everyone time to absorb the magnitude of what had been revealed, but it was clear that the final confrontation was approaching. Richard's web of lies was unraveling rapidly, and the community was beginning to understand just how deeply they had been betrayed by someone they had trusted with their economic future. When court reconvened the following morning, the atmosphere in the Millbrook County Courthouse was charged with anticipation. Overnight, Detective Rodriguez and her team had worked with state investigators to process the mountain of evidence that had emerged. The local newspaper had run a special edition detailing the unfolding scandal, and reporters from Major, Ohio, newspapers had joined the growing media presence outside the courthouse. Margaret arrived early, hoping to avoid the cameras and questions that had made her drive home the previous evening feel like running a gauntlet. Max walked beside her with his usual calm dignity, seemingly unaffected by the chaos surrounding them. Several community members approached to offer support, including Eleanor Patterson from the diner, who pressed a thermos of coffee into Margaret's hands with a warm smile. "Half the town's been talking about this all night," Eleanor said quietly. "People are saying you're a hero for standing up to Richard and his schemes." Margaret felt uncomfortable with the hero label. She had simply been trying to defend herself against what she believed was an unfair lawsuit. The fact that Max's unique abilities had exposed a much larger conspiracy felt more like destiny than heroism. The courtroom filled quickly, with every seat occupied and people standing along the walls. Judge Harrison had allowed expanded seating to accommodate the community interest, understanding that the outcome of these proceedings would affect everyone in Millbrook for years to come. Richard entered with his legal team, but his appearance had changed dramatically overnight. The confident businessman who had filed the original lawsuit was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His expensive suit was wrinkled, His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his eyes darted nervously around. The courtroom. Judge Harrison called the session to order with unusual formality. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to address new evidence that has emerged during our investigation of the Blackwood versus Sullivan case. I want to emphasize that these proceedings are being conducted under the supervision of state authorities and may result in criminal charges against multiple individuals. Detective Rodriguez rose to present the results of the overnight investigation. Her team had discovered financial records showing systematic payments from Richard's business accounts to various county employees over a 5-year period. The amounts were carefully calculated to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements, but the pattern was unmistakable. Mr. Blackwood made monthly payments totaling over $200,000 to county officials who had access to land records, environmental assessments, and planning documents, Detective Rodriguez announced. These payments coincided precisely with periods when Mr. Blackwood was pursuing major land acquisitions. The detective presented a detailed timeline, showing how the conspiracy had operated. Richard would identify properties he wanted to acquire, then his accomplices within county government would alter or destroy documents that might interfere with his plans. Environmental reports showing healthy soil conditions were replaced with fake assessments claiming contamination. Property surveys were modified to suggest boundary disputes or easement problems. Historical records documenting previous land use were made to disappear entirely. The scope of this operation required intimate knowledge of county record-keeping systems and access to secure filing areas, Detective Rodriguez continued. Our investigation has identified at least 4 county employees who participated in this conspiracy, including Planning Director Steve Morrison, Environmental Inspector Linda Walsh, Records Clerk Patricia Hughes, and Assessment Office Manager David Chen. The naming of specific individuals sent shockwaves through the courtroom. These were people that community members had trusted with important decisions affecting their property and livelihood. Margaret recognized several faces in the crowd turning pale as they realized how many of their own dealings with the county might have been compromised. Tom Mitchell was called forward to present additional evidence he had uncovered during his expanded investigation. Working with state investigators, he had gained access to backup computer files that county employees thought had been permanently deleted. We recovered electronic communications between Mr. Blackwood and his accomplices, discussing specific documents to be altered or destroyed, Tom reported. Email chains show detailed planning of which environmental reports to falsify and when to remove problematic survey data from county files. One email exchange was particularly damaging. In it, Richard instructed Steve Morrison to make sure the Miller Farm environmental report shows contamination problems and promised a bonus payment for handling this delicate situation. Morrison replied, confirming that he would take care of the documentation and ensure that Richard's development plans faced no environmental obstacles. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Judge Harrison paused frequently to allow the court reporter to catch up with the rapid-fire presentation of documents, emails, and financial records that painted a complete picture of the conspiracy. The most dramatic moment of the morning came when Detective Rodriguez announced that Steve Morrison had agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for reduced charges. Morrison had provided detailed testimony about how the conspiracy operated and had revealed information that expanded the scope of the investigation beyond what anyone had imagined. Mr. Morrison has informed us that this operation extended far beyond land deals in Millbrook County, Detective Rodriguez announced. Similar schemes were operating in 3 neighboring counties, all coordinated by Mr. Blackwood and involving dozens of corrupt officials. The revelation that Richard's corruption extended across multiple counties elevated the case to a level that could involve federal investigators. What had started as a local property dispute was now a major white-collar crime investigation with potential connections to organized fraud spanning half of southeastern Ohio. Richard's attorney Thompson requested an emergency consultation with his client, but the damage was already done. The evidence against Richard was so comprehensive that any defense strategy would require admitting to some level of wrongdoing while trying to minimize criminal liability. As the morning session continued, Judge Harrison announced that additional witnesses were being brought forward. To everyone's surprise, 3 more county employees had contacted investigators offering to provide information about Richard's activities. The conspiracy was collapsing as participants rushed to cooperate with authorities rather than face the full consequences of their involvement. The final revelation of the morning came when Detective Rodriguez presented evidence that Richard had attempted to destroy additional documents after learning about the investigation. Search warrants executed at his business offices had uncovered a paper shredder running hot with recently destroyed documents, and computer forensics had revealed desperate attempts to delete electronic files. Mr. Blackwood's attempts to destroy evidence demonstrate consciousness of guilt and suggest that additional crimes were committed even after the investigation began. Detective Rodriguez concluded. Margaret watched as Richard's world collapsed around him. The man who had seemed so powerful and untouchable just days earlier was now facing the possibility of federal charges that could result in decades in prison. His attempt to silence her through legal intimidation had instead exposed the very crimes he had worked so hard to conceal. Max sat quietly beside her throughout the proceedings, occasionally lifting his head to observe the courtroom with alert intelligence. Several people had approached Margaret during breaks to ask about Max's remarkable abilities, and she was beginning to understand that her dog was truly exceptional. His instinctive preservation of evidence had not only saved her from an unjust lawsuit, but had exposed corruption that threatened the integrity of their entire regional government. As Judge Harrison called for a lunch recess before the afternoon's final presentations, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The truth was finally emerging, but she knew that the consequences would reshape Millbrook and the surrounding communities in ways that no one could fully predict. The quiet life she had known was ending, replaced by something uncertain but undeniably more honest than what had come before. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the same courthouse where her ordeal had begun, but this time she was there as a witness in the federal prosecution of Richard Blackwood and his accomplices. The modest county courtroom had been replaced by a larger federal facility in Columbus, where the case had attracted national attention as an example of rural corruption and the importance of document preservation in exposing white-collar crime. Max accompanied her as always, though he now wore a special vest identifying him as a certified evidence recovery dog. Following the Millbrook revelations, he had been formally evaluated by federal law enforcement specialists who confirmed his exceptional abilities and recommended additional training. At the age of 8, Max had begun a new career working with state investigators to help solve cold cases involving missing documents. The federal trial had proceeded efficiently, with Richard and his co-conspirators facing overwhelming evidence of their crimes. Steve Morrison's cooperation had led to additional discoveries of corruption in 4 counties, ultimately involving over 30 government employees and millions of dollars in fraudulent land deals. The scope of the conspiracy had shocked even experienced federal prosecutors. Richard himself had eventually agreed to a plea bargain that resulted in a 12-year federal prison sentence and complete restitution to victims of his schemes. His development company had been dissolved, and his personal assets were being liquidated to compensate communities and individuals who had suffered from his fraudulent activities. Margaret's original lawsuit had been dismissed with prejudice, and Richard was required to pay her legal fees and additional damages for the emotional distress caused by his frivolous litigation. More importantly, the Millbrook Community Garden had been expanded and officially protected in perpetuity as a monument to the importance of community activism and transparency in government. The changes in Millbrook had been dramatic but ultimately positive. The corrupt county employees had been replaced by officials committed to transparency and ethical conduct. New procedures for document security and public access had been implemented, making it much harder for similar conspiracies to develop in the future. Tom Mitchell had won a state journalism award for his investigative reporting on the scandal, and his articles had been syndicated in newspapers across Ohio and neighboring states. He had also written a book about the case titled Max's Justice: How a Dog Exposed Rural Corruption, with proceeds supporting animal rescue organizations and investigative journalism programs. Eleanor Patterson's Diner had become an unofficial tourist destination for people interested in the case, and she had added a Max Burger to her menu, with proceeds going to fund search and rescue dog training programs. The community had embraced its unexpected fame while working to rebuild trust in local government. Margaret herself had been reluctant to accept the public attention that followed the case resolution. She had declined numerous interview requests and book deals, preferring to return to her quiet life of community service. However, she had agreed to serve on a new county oversight committee responsible for ensuring transparency in government operations. On this particular afternoon, Margaret was attending a ceremony honoring Max and other working dogs who had contributed to law enforcement efforts across Ohio. Governor Patricia Willis had traveled to Millbrook to present Max with a special commendation for his role in exposing corruption and protecting democratic institutions. Max represents the very best of what happens when training, instinct and dedication combine to serve the cause of justice, Governor Willis announced to the assembled crowd in Millbrook's renovated courthouse square. His actions remind us that truth has a way of emerging, sometimes from the most unexpected sources. The ceremony attracted visitors from across the state, including other working dog handlers, law enforcement officials, and journalists documenting the ongoing impact of the case. Margaret felt proud but slightly overwhelmed by the attention, grateful that Max seemed to enjoy the festivities more than she did. Following the ceremony, Margaret walked with Max through the expanded community garden that had started everything. The space now included educational displays about environmental protection, government transparency, and the importance of civic engagement. A bronze plaque near the entrance honored Max and all working dogs who serve justice and community protection. The garden itself had flourished beyond Margaret's original vision. Volunteers from across the county maintained vegetable plots that provided fresh produce for local food banks, and the space hosted regular educational programs for children and adults about sustainable agriculture and environmental stewardship. Margaret paused at Robert Miller's memorial corner of the garden, where a small monument honored the farmer whose hidden note had started the chain of revelations. Miller had passed away from natural causes 2 years before the scandal broke, but his family had attended the ceremony to express gratitude that his attempts to document the truth had finally been vindicated. He always said the truth would come out eventually, Miller's daughter had told Margaret during the ceremony. He just never imagined it would take a German shepherd to make it happen. As the afternoon sun filtered through the trees surrounding the garden, Margaret reflected, on how dramatically her life had changed since that first day in court. The quiet existence she had valued had been replaced by a more public role as an advocate for government transparency and animal welfare causes. Max had adapted to his new responsibilities with characteristic intelligence and grace. He spent several days each month working with state investigators on cold cases, and his success rate in locating hidden documents had led to reopened investigations across 3 states. His story had inspired other communities to train search dogs specifically for document recovery operations. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond Millbrook. State legislatures across the Midwest had passed new laws requiring enhanced security for public documents and protecting whistleblowers who reported government corruption. The Millbrook Protocols for document preservation and public access had been adopted by counties in 12 states. Margaret's relationship with her community had deepened as well. The shared experience of uncovering and confronting corruption had brought neighbors together in ways that transcended previous social and political divisions. The monthly town halls that had been established following the scandal drew consistently large crowds of engaged citizens committed to maintaining the transparency that had been won at such a high cost. As evening approached, Margaret and Max walked home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, passing the diner where Eleanor waved from behind the counter, the courthouse where their incredible journey had begun, and the small houses where friends and neighbors were settling in for another peaceful evening in their transformed community. The events that had started with a simple property dispute had ultimately strengthened the bonds between community members and their government. The painful process of exposing corruption had led to reforms that would protect future generations from similar betrayals of public trust. Margaret opened her front gate and settled onto her porch with Max beside her, watching the sunset paint. The Ohio sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The tranquility she had once taken for granted felt more precious now, earned through struggle and strengthened by truth. Max rested his head on her lap, content in the knowledge that his work had served justice and protected the community they both loved. His remarkable journey from shelter dog to celebrated working animal embodied the American ideals of second chances, hard work, and the belief that every individual, regardless of their background, could make a meaningful contribution to society. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret scratched behind Max's ears and smiled at the thought of all the other communities where dogs like Max might be quietly preserving evidence that could someday restore justice and protect the innocent. The truth, as they had learned, had a way of finding the light, especially when helped by those who remained faithful to the cause of what was right. Dear viewers, we hope Margaret and Max's extraordinary story has moved and inspired you. Their journey reminds us that truth and justice often emerge from the most unexpected places, and that every community has heroes waiting to make a difference. To continue following stories of courage, integrity, and the remarkable bonds between humans and animals, we've prepared a special playlist of equally captivating narratives that celebrate the triumph of truth over deception. You can find it by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed Margaret and Max's story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of life, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the incredible ways that ordinary individuals can change their communities for the better. Don't miss our upcoming content featuring more inspiring tales of justice, loyalty, and the power of truth. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below about how this story affected you, or if you have your own experiences with remarkable animals who made a difference in your community.